Welcome to The Mail Room, a new series in which, in just 3 30-minute programmes, my guests and I will comprehensively, inarguably define what it means to be a man. Well, perhaps we won't do that, but we will chat, banter, and then walk out the room whenever we feel we might cry. Tonight, we're going to be talking about inadequacy, because I sometimes do feel like I'm an inadequate man. That feels like a strange thing to admit to on air, but I said it as well in a video that we posted to Radio 4's Facebook page last week. Here are some responses that we had. Abby Palash, Christ almighty, sort yourself out. Seth Petterson said, I had to call my ex to get help to assemble IKEA furniture. And Trevor West replied to say the sexiest men are those who can talk about their feelings and recognise their weaknesses as well as their strengths. Well, with that ringing in our ears, let's meet my very sexy guests. With me in the studio, I have the writer and podcaster Ogaga Emeveyan, the feminist comedian, and you'll note not a man, Kate Smurthwaite. But first, the person I want to speak to is Mark Hayhurst. Because, Mark, you started up a men's group in Surbiton called The Talking Stick. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I was coming up to my 50th birthday, and I've been married for 33 years. I got 4 kids, I got numerous grandchildren, and as I was coming up to 50, it was like looming like this enormous, ominous thing in front of me, where I just felt I'd played a role all my life, and I played it well in that period, particularly until our youngest son was old enough and had gone through university and became responsible for himself. And at that point it was like, okay, I don't need to play that role anymore. And my wife specifically said to me, there was an incident, details which don't matter, but she said, I don't need a knight in shining armour. And that was the role I'd played all that time. And I realised that I was carrying this bloody great suit of armour that was encumbering me, that I couldn't see out of. It wasn't me. I was dressed as something, and I needed to things that really helped me was to start going to a men's group. And living as I do in the suburbs, I thought there must be hundreds of guys like me who are kind of facing the same challenge and asking the same questions. And
what
so
questions
the same thing.
are those?
What am I doing? You know, what's my life about? And particularly about feeling. For me, it was about having felt kind of neutral all my life. I just wasn't kind of connected with my feelings and who I really was, and that was what was needed to come out. And if it didn't, it would be like a slow downhill journey to the end of my life, really, which was unacceptable to me. And that kind of focus of the 50th birthday really was what sealed it for me, that I had to take some action.
And Ogaga Emeveyan, you've done something similar in that you have a kind of male support group, but your one is on WhatsApp.
Yeah, so a friend of mine created it, and at first I was kind of like, not really, this is all weird, leave me alone. And now it's one of the best things I've ever done in my life. And it's these guys in the group are what I admire and I adore and I love them. And I feel okay to kind of express deep emotions for them, because I think a lot of people have problems, as he was just saying. So that's kind of what the group has given me, a space to be myself.
But do you think that younger men than Mark are actually walking around feeling more confident and being able to say, as you just did, you know, I love this guy who's a man and we have this emotion together and we talk about our feelings? Or do you think actually, just like Mark and, you know, the feeling that he had when he got to his 50s, actually you can say those things on WhatsApp, but you still don't say them face to face, or you still don't say them when you're around other people?
I think there's an element of that, and this is a constant process of trying to unlearn whatever baggage you've already got, whatever things you've been conditioned into thinking. I've got a friend who feels he's not earning enough money in terms of, so he's single and currently meeting women for casual dates and stuff, but he feels a lot of the times they get talking and then money becomes an issue. That kind of bothers him, that becomes a thing for him.
That links to what you were saying, doesn't it, Mark? The sense of when your kids left home, basically feeling, well, what's my role here now? I've been working all this time doing this thing to be the provider, to be the man, and then suddenly actually I feel a bit lost about that. Yeah,
I mean, it was kind of quite conscious as that now was the time for me to live a bit, really, and to blossom, I guess.
And Ogaga, your partner actually earns more money than you.
Yeah, thanks for saying it like that.
I've been looking through her tax records.
Yeah, she does. She earns a spectacular amount more than I do. But that's a situation that works for us. It makes things easier for us.
Yeah, but does it? Because I know that fact because you've talked about it before and how it could be seen as quite emasculating.
Yeah. I mean, it could be, but as I said, for us, what works is that she earns more money. I can't turn around and say, quit your job and get a lower paying job, because that doesn't make sense. I like going on nice holidays.
Yeah, but this is the woman that I know you've talked about marrying, and the woman that, hopefully one day you're going to have some kids with. Are you going to be a house husband? Would you take that decision to be the one who looks after the kids, to say, yes, she's the alpha female? Or at some level, does even the younger, politically correct with it man say, hold on, that just goes counter to how I instinctively feel?
This is something we've both spoken about. We've both discussed it, being a house husband. At the point of us in a few years' time having children, I may be able to work in a consulting role where I work from home and look after the children.
Okay, Kate Smithwaite, you've been hearing, as I have, men being quite articulate about their emotions this evening. I know you've got a character, which is a bloke who goes around still shouting out football scores long after the game is over. That's, based on a stereotype, obviously. But is there some truth in that men still struggle with articulacy, particularly around emotion, or is that changing?
Yes, there is obviously a shift going on in the way that we see men's roles in society. Once upon a time, the only role for men was sort of provider or sort of military guy, those kind of roles. And obviously the world is changing, and these days lots of women want to have those same ambitions, and there's kind of a gap there. There's kind of a gap in what does masculinity look like? And I have so many male friends who've ended up in a group of guys, and they're out on a stag do. One guy in particular, it's his own stag do. He didn't even want to have a stag do. He was like, can we go for Thai food? And his mates felt obliged to drag him to a strip club. They felt obliged to pay a woman to and he was hating every second. He was literally sat there going, could you make this quick, because I just want to go. And yet for a lot of guys it's very difficult. It's like exactly that thing of guys who don't drink.
Doesn't drink, feels like he's not a proper man, feels like he's inadequate. Yeah,
exactly. And so that's exactly why I wrote this character. I call him Milo Standards. And he is this guy who's lost his way in life, and he's hanging on to this idea of what masculinity is, that involves, yes, still singing the score 4 hours after the football game has finished. And, that's what he thinks guys are supposed to do. And I think I wanted to write a show and highlight this, because I think that it's rather a pervasive culture. When I've looked at Donald Trump and the campaign behind him, I've seen a lot of that sort of toxic masculinity, and often that idea that men have to define themselves in opposition to women. And I think that's hugely destructive. I consider myself a feminist not because I want women to do better and men to do less well, but because I think that actually opening up these roles for women, like giving women the freedom to take on new roles in business, in politics and all that stuff, actually it goes beautifully hand in hand with people like the people sat in this room right here, who are happy to break out of more traditional masculine roles and say, actually, I'd love to be a primary caregiver to children. I'd love to be somebody who is more focused on the emotional needs of those around me. And I think that we're actually all in the same battle, as it were, to say these rules are not sensible rules. Let's have a better sort of world where we can all do what we want.
Let me bring in another guest now, which is Johnny Green. Johnny was the road manager of The Clash, currently on the road with John Cooper Clarke. He's down the line in our Salford studio. Hi there, Johnny.
Yeah, hello there.
Hi.
Yeah.
I mean, you've heard a lot.
I was listening to what Kate said, and and that's a real good point. And people often ask me when they say, oh yeah, life out on the road as a rock and roller, they assume it's all Led Zeppelin and groupies. And I'm aware that does go on, or has gone on. But it doesn't have to go on. I never found that with The Clash. I'm not saying it was a group of monks out there living a celibate life, but it certainly wasn't, I would hope not, and I think not, abusive. And there were genuine conversations that went on. And part of the reason that went on is because it's a group of fellas travelling who did actually talk about their feelings in transit, in hotel rooms, in dressing rooms. And I found them to be thoroughly decent people.
Yeah, but I don't remember a moment where The Clash all put their guitars down, sat around and had a nice conversation about their emotions on stage. So, I mean, it might be what's fueling their music, but it's not their public face.
Well, no, but you don't get to see in a dressing room or a hotel room at 2 o'clock in the morning, do you? Mm. But then I'm listening with interest to what Mark and Agaga have been saying. And of course, I don't recognise that kind of career carer aspect of stuff, because that's not how I've lived my life. And the people I know, really, what they did was follow their own instincts, their own attitudes. But I recall that nobody had known at the time that Joe Strummer's brother, David, had committed suicide right in the middle of Regent's Park. And he asked me to go for a walk with him one night, and we walked around Regent's Park, and he opened up, and we ended up 3 hours talking about how he felt about that, what had happened to his brother, how it had knocked onto his mother and father, how he carried that burden with him now, sitting on a bench under the moonlight talking about it. And I said to him, you should share that with the rest of the band, which he did.
Wow. And
yeah, he was seen as, this kind of tough guy. The whole band benefited from it because it then spilled over the edges, and the other members of the band started to reveal their own kind of inner secrets, if you like, and there had been secrets. It worked.
It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it, Mark, to say, tell us your vulnerabilities and that'll make you stronger.
Absolutely. And it's as we were saying, it's about practicing that. It's about exercising a muscle as men that we're not used to exercising, and we're not encouraged to exercise. We are certainly historically. My dad was of a generation where he was emotionally mute. He was a good man, but I never saw any emotion at all. And so, I grew up in an environment where it was subdued. And I think people become more expansive. We all have these experiences. We're all emotional beings. We're all feeling beings. We all have the same inadequacies and concerns. We all go from birth to death. And as Johnny was talking, I just remembered there was a recently, Oliver Burtman, the Guardian journalist, basically said, remember, we're all winging it all the time.
Agaga, I know you've talked a lot about your dad and how you're very different to your dad, that he came from an environment which, if you weren't careful, you'd sort of end up mimicking, and you realise what's wrong with that way of life or that way of thinking about yourself as a man. Does that sort of relate to what we've just been discussing?
So my father's a very patriarchal Nigerian man who sees things in the only way he knows how. I feel our relationship isn't as strong as it should be, because there are things I know I'd say and he just laugh, and it's fine because that's him. I see him, we talk about football, we make some jokes, and that's it. And we have a good time, but I don't feel we have that deeper connection in that way.
Would you feel embarrassed to cry in front of him?
I don't think so, but that's more, I don't cry in front of many people. I don't cry very often. So I'm looking forward to getting married, and I really hope I cry on that day. Like, I feel like I'd want a refund if I don't cry.
Maybe you'll cry when you hear you're not getting a refund.
Yeah. But your dad's not going to cry on your wedding day, basically.
No, he's not going to cry.
And you're okay with that?
Yeah, because it's my dad. Like, if you've met the man and you know the man, and everyone that knows him, he's very lovely. Like, he's not a bad person.
But is he playing a role? I mean, that's what I'm getting at. The connection with the stories we've just been hearing. Is he playing a role as well? You're saying he knows no other way but to do that.
But I think it gets to a point where it's like method acting. It gets to a point where at what point does the role stop, and at what point is now this the person?
Yeah. And
I think that's where it gets to, for a lot of people, it just meshes. Of course, there'll be men who are stoic, who don't readily just free up their emotions and aren't that way because of maybe conditioning. I guess there are people who are generally that careful about their emotions, but I feel there are also men who aren't. There's more scope for saying we should allow all these things to kind of be, instead of saying there's one way to be.
Well, last weekend I went along to the Being a Man Festival. Have you heard about this?
I have.
BAM, as it's known, as its acronym, which is at the South Bank Centre in London. It's kind of like Glastonbury, except instead of having Morrissey as a headliner, you have people theorising about pornography. And I went along with my microphone to ask whether the men who were there felt inadequate, and if so, when.
It could be on the tube standing next to someone who's twice the size of you, who's taller, who's more muscly. Suddenly you feel inadequate in front of all these people in public, in the tube, and it's that's when you feel inadequate. But then sometimes you can feel inadequate when you're with your friends who are also male, and they're opening up, and yet you don't feel you can do that.
I was a young dad, and I didn't really have my dad in my life, so I think that in my early years as a dad, parenting, I felt inadequate because I didn't have the experience to fulfill that role. So I always found myself chasing my tail, thinking, am I doing the right thing? And then I guess the older people around me wanted me to parent their way, and that made me feel quite insignificant, and I felt quite de-skilled.
Is the thing that men are still struggling with articulating their emotions?
I think like naturally we all are anyway as men, but I definitely think like for me I notice it like more in like young black guys. I think we like struggle to articulate even to each other.
But you said to me just a moment ago off mic, you said you work with grime music.
Yes.
I mean, that's a genre where people are expressing their feelings.
Yes.
Mostly men.
Yes, but they're not articulating it very well. That's the problem. They articulate it through maybe anger and not actually trying to explain themselves or say why. So yeah.
I'm Olly Mann, and you're listening to The Mail Room. We've got a new guest with us in the studio now, Jules Evans. Hello.
Hello.
Hi. You talk to rugby players about philosophy.
That's right. So basically, I run a philosophy club at Saracens. They're the best rugby team in Europe. And about 3 years ago, they invited me in randomly to give a talk about a book I wrote about Greek philosophy, which you can imagine was an unusual situation for me. I stood in front of the whole team, these enormous players, and talked about how philosophy had helped me through depression and social anxiety. So there would be about 10 or 15 of the players, including like some of the best players in the world, like Owen Farrell and Mario Itoje. And I give a bit of a talk about ideas that the ancient Greeks used to help them understand and change their emotions. And then the team would just would have a discussion about it. So we've done sessions on how to control your temper. So I talked about how the Stoics, Stoic philosophy, you mentioned them earlier. The Stoics had this bad rep as like not talking about their emotions at all. In fact, the Stoics were really talked about their emotions all the time and how to control them. And then there was this amazing discussion where one of the coaches talked about how he used to have a really terrible temper and how he learned to control his temper by actually wearing a kind of rubber band around his wrist. And when he felt the red mist descending, he would snap this rubber band. I think for men are quite uncomfortable with therapy. So women are twice as likely to seek therapy as men. But men are much more comfortable with philosophy. If you present the same kind of ideas and techniques as philosophy, that gives them more of a permission to start kind of opening up to each other.
Kate, you worked in investment banking for a while.
I did, nearly 10 years.
That is an environment where you're sort of knuckle-dragging alpha male is the way to behave.
Yes, I was on some trading floors, and that exactly that culture of banter, and in some ways I sort of cut my teeth there, that these days I play a big room full of stag do's, and where did I learn to deal with a load of leery drunk guys who are going to sexualise every word I say? And the answer is probably on a trading floor.
Well, so Saracens a few years ago was quite a brutal club. They had quite a vicious culture. They really took the piss out of each other. It was quite aggressive kind of banter. And they also weren't that good. They didn't win that much. And they took a conscious decision to try and change their culture, to make it more supportive of each other, to get people talking to each other. And they became a lot better because they started just looking out for each other more, being able to open up to each other without being afraid that someone was going to just shoot them down, and actually bonded them a lot as a team. And they became, the best in Europe.
Johnny Green, what do you make of that?
Well, I really like what Jules was saying because I could relate and identify that thing about looking out for each other.
I think the younger players come in and they look to the older players about how should I carry myself? What does it mean to be a professional sports player? And if they see the older players, behaving like dicks and mistreating other people and mistreating women, they'll think, that's what to do. If you're trying to build a healthy culture, look to your leaders to set a good example.
And I mean, we were talking, Johnny mentioned sort of tough guys, which I guess it's difficult recording as we are very close to transmission not to think about Eric Bristow and how he's been in the news in the past few days. I've got his quote in front of me, actually. This is what he wrote on Twitter. I mean, without going into the whole horrible scenario that he was reacting to, this is what he said. Dart players, tough guys. Footballers, wimps. You got to sort him out when you get older, or don't look in the mirror. Glad I am a dart player. Proper. I wonder whether you do need to thump someone to be a proper man, whether that is still something that some people think is the definition of being a leader, being a man.
That's terrible. I was listening to what Kate was saying earlier as well about, the bankers. Now, I've never been on a stag do. And when I see the behaviour, and I've seen them in city bars and stuff, of bankers, I'm appalled and disgusted by that, not enthralled. And I can't relate to that at all, any more than I can relate to my dear old dad, God rest his soul, who couldn't boil an egg, but provided for the family. I thought, I don't want to be like that. The really attractive rock and rollers are the ones that reveal a certain vulnerability, even a certain aspect of their femininity within their masculinity. Does that make sense?
It does. It's just different to what I'd expect you to say. I guess, there's that old line, isn't there, of what goes on tour stays on tour. And there's this kind of idea around the groups that you used to manage that on the road, that basically that was the release I was talking about earlier. That if you're a rock and roll guy, then going on tour is your chance to sort of go around the country being an alpha male, being a bit of a dick.
I quite agree. Bit of a dick's a very good expression. But, the first support band that ever came out on the road with the Clash were the Slits, an all female band. They're a very articulate women and very interesting women. And it was matched across. So maybe we all learned that lesson at a very early stage in punk rock. I don't know.
But Jules, on the rugby field...
Well, one thing they get, right, I look at them and they talk about how they love each other, they're really bonded. And one of the reasons I think they often struggle with retirement is they lose that strong male unit competing together, and they talk about putting their bodies on the line. I mean, if you watch a game, the tackles they're giving, just, it's quite intense. And then, so they get to kind of express that just affection and also kind of physical intimacy, which is not really there in modern life for men. It was there for hundreds of thousands of years and it's gone. It's the same with soldiers. I mean, one of the things they really struggle with when they come home is that loss of that unit, of that close proximity and intimacy and ability to express love. So I think it's interesting to think about how do we create places in our society where men can find that kind of group thing. And I suppose a band is another form of that. You're out there going on road, going on a campaign, really looking out for each other in that close intimacy. There aren't that many places like that left in modern society.
That's true, but part of the knack is to learn the technique so that when you stop doing that you then transmit that to your own chosen group of friends in your private life.
Right. But I mean, both of you are sort of making it sound like everyone involved in either rock music or sport, in respect, is sort of happy, clappy and open about their feelings and emotional and honest. Whereas we know, the phrase locker room banter, one of those toxic phrases Kate mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
But the humour should...
just mentioned the military, because we know the military is a huge problem with a culture of misogyny in certain parts, and it's something that they've really been trying to deal with, when it comes to dealing with female service personnel who are working with them, but also coming back into a society that's much more mixed, and must be so difficult to have gotten used to that as a way of living, and then to come out and you say these things, and most of the time people are going to look around and go, what on earth are you doing? How is that an okay way to behave? And if we don't challenge the culture that's there, it's difficult, because of course men want to bond, great, but I find it fascinating. We always come back to this idea of how we define sort of, even the whole festival is called Being a Man, isn't it? The Being a Man Festival. And it just put me to wondering, because I am not, by any standards, modern or old-fashioned, any good at being a woman. I can't cook, I don't stay home, I have 0 children, and I don't feel, personally, in the least bit bothered about that.
However, every man has been in a situation, maybe not since they were a teenager, where that is what would bring you together, is making quite cheap, nasty jokes about people. Mm-hmm. Maybe it descends into bullying sometimes. I mean, Agaga, I'm interested with your WhatsApp group of young men. I'm in a WhatsApp group of NCT dads. So all of us, when we found out we were about to have a baby, or our partners were, we joined this group. And ostensibly, it's so that we can talk about our children. But actually, everything in that group, well, 90% of what's in that group is literally, here's a beer I bought today, have you got this one? It's available in the supermarket. When shall we go for a drink? Here's a picture of some porn that I found on the internet. Nothing to do with the thing that we're supposed to be talking about. And it's almost like that level of banter is necessary. Is that happening in your group as well, even where you're saying people are being so emotional and open?
We do have a great level of banter. A lot of what we talk about, we debate music a lot. It'd be like, what's your top 12 Jay-Z songs in his whole discography? And we discussed that at length. We discussed many things, but I don't feel we have that locker room banter because that doesn't make sense. Why would you willfully just say disgusting things?
Just pick up something kind of Kate said. It's interesting. I mean, do men need to like identify as men? Do we need to get together in men's group? I think in some ways these kind of movements and groups arose in the kind of from the 70s a bit in response to feminism. And they're kind of men looking at like consciousness raising circles of women in the 70s thinking, yeah, that's good. And like, let's get together and defend our rights. And I look at the kind of manosphere now, and it really reminds me of kind of, you know, radical feminism in the 70s. And often the most outspoken kind of prophets of manhood are gay, just like, you know, the most radical feminists were lesbians. And they're like, let's completely separate from women and just form our own kind of men's club. I think it's an interesting question. Is this a useful thing, or are we just falling prey to the same kind of identity politics that, you know, I don't know what you guys think.
In a perfect world, I would like gender to just not be an issue and we just all form groups with those around us who want to talk to and share our emotions with. But there is a difficulty that over the years, you know, men have been seen as the important ones and the dominant ones and all this kind of stuff. So if we want to get young men to listen, sadly, much as I wish it weren't true, they are more likely to listen to other men. Mm-hmm. So when we've got these brilliant groups and we've got really positive male role models, I think, wow, these guys have so much more power to influence young guys. I wish I had that much power, but I know that young men will listen to people like some of the men around this table more than they'll listen to me, without their defences coming up kind of thing. And then on the other hand, there are definitely some men's groups that are not doing something useful and some aspects of men's culture that are really setting out to define masculinity as something that is in opposition to women and something that is very negative and aggressive. And so in that sense, I think, we need to sort of break these down. But I don't think we need to ever build a world where you can't have a group. If you feel like your group wants to have a meeting, I don't think we should ever go, no. And there are some wonderful men's groups out there. I was hosting this about 10 years ago, the first ever Feminism in London conference, and there's a group called the London Pro-Feminist Men's Network, and so we got in touch with them and said, well, you guys must want to come and be part of the conference. What do you want to do? And they had a little meeting and they get together and they thought about this very carefully, and they came back and they said, we'd like to run the creche. And we were just like, yes, wow, this is mind officially blown. It hadn't even occurred to me that there would be a man's group that was so on the ball and so like just knew what they were doing and knew exactly the best possible thing to say. And
well, there you are, on
great.
the ball. You've even given us a rugby metaphor as well to end with. I'm going to blow the whistle on this or something. Thank you very much, Kate. Smurthwaite, also Mark Hayhurst, Agaga, Emma Vaughan, Johnny Green and Jules Evans. We have an email address. Very exciting. This is the 21st century. We are themailroom@bbc.co.uk. Do get in touch with us and let us know your responses to anything we've been discussing on today's show, and our topic for the next edition of The Mailroom, which will all be about anger. Vent now. It's late at night. Vent now. Get it off your chest and we'll talk about it next week. I've been Olly Mann. Thanks for listening.